Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Brian and Jim with DrinkABeerandPlayAGame, and today kicks off a month dedicated to our favorite fighting game series. I am, of course, talking about Mortal Kombat. So naturally, we're starting off with the debut game that redefined arcade and video game violence, and would later be ported to the Super NES and Genesis.
Originally released to the arcades in 1992, Mortal Kombat was developed and published by Midway Games. At its release, this was quite possibly the most controversial game of all time, and directly led to the introduction of the ESRB rating system that we still know and love today. Anyway, like Bryce said, we're going to be doing the Genesis and Super NES ports of this today, but it also came out on the Amiga, DOS, Game Boy, Game Gear, Sega CD. It's been everywhere. You'd be it even has a TV plug-and-play version, alright? Jesus Christ.
Jimmy forgot to mention the movie!
You can't play a movie!
When you put in a DVD player, don't
Shut
you
up!
have to hit play?
Shut your mouth. Shut your goddamn mouth.
You have to hit play.
So the Genesis port was handled by Probe Software, while the Super NES port was done by Sculptured Software. And we're going to look at the differences between each of them, and the pros and cons.
Alright, so talking about the graphics, the first thing you gotta mention about a Mortal Kombat game is that all the sprites are digitized. And while this is not the first, because technically the first game to do it was Rikai Doshi Chinese Exorcist. Obviously, we had to look that up on the very reliable Wikipedia, and that is followed by Pit Fighter. So anyway, let's take a look at it. As you can see from the side-by-side comparison, the Super NES looks just a little bit better than the Genesis, mostly in background objects and additional animations, and the frame rate just seems a little bit smoother overall. But don't get me wrong, they both look fine to me and Jim. Neither one is a great port of the arcade, which looks 10 times better, but at the time, porting from arcades was still really rudimentary, and this is what we were left with. The only other difference, and Jim I'm sure will mention it later in gameplay, is that in the Super NES, there's no blood. Now in the Sega, you have to put in a code, but at least they still included it. And that's something that was a huge pet peeve of mine. So anyway, as you can see, for the Super NES, me and Jim both gave it a 7, and for the Genesis, we both gave it a 6. I'm only gonna add, this is a tough one. I'll add 2 beers, and really, it's just for the fact that it could have looked a little smoother, and there should have been goddamn blood in the Super NES version.
Alright, the sound. Outside of the blood, this is probably the area where you're going to see the most drastic differences between these two ports. On the Super NES, it tried to mimic the tracks from the arcade, but the quality, I'm sorry, I just didn't like it. Brian liked it a little more than I did, but I just found it grating. You just get so much just high-pitched grating sounds. It really sounds like they're using the upper registers of an old Casio keyboard from the 80s. I don't know, everything just sounds muddy, there's a little too much reverb for my liking. The music just doesn't do it for me. Outside of that, the sound effects there's a lot of them, and they do a good job of mimicking the fighter sounds, the moves, the sounds of actual contact. It does a good job of that, and it really redeems the overall presentation in that sense. The Genesis, on the other hand, the port kind of keeps to the arcade in some tracks, but in other tracks it almost has completely new arranged tunes. The difference is, I like these tracks a lot. The music, especially the percussion, just really sounds crisp and clear. Everything's so dynamic, and the tracks are just memorable. Unfortunately, the Genesis is missing a lot of the extra sound effects though. Sometimes you'll be punching, you won't hear anything, kicks will be silent, the grunts and the sound effects for the voice work just won't be there half the time. It really hurts. Personally, when it comes to sound in the game, I could take good music over missing sound effects any day. So, on the Super NES, Brian gave the sound a 7, I gave it a 5. And on the Genesis, Brian gave it a 7, and I gave it a 6. Overall, you're going to get a good presentation either way. It really just depends what your tastes are and what you're looking for. And I'm only going to add 2 beers, just because while it's good, it's still a little lacking no matter what platform.
Alright, before I start talking about the control, let me mention one thing. Jim is a hater of the Super NES.
No, I'm not!
So his scores will be skewed no matter what.
Only on this one!
He hates the Super NES because it's better than Genesis, but that's besides the point. Anyway, as far as control, Here's the only other area me and Jim really disagree on some of the aspects, and what I'll have to say right up front is the control scheme in Mortal Kombat is unique. Everybody at this point is used to Street Fighter and every Street Fighter clone that's been out. This introduced some new concepts, such as using a button for block. Now, by no means is it the first fighting game to use a button for block, but once again, it's the most popular, and at this point, everyone's used to holding back. I hate holding back for block. Jim loves it, I hate it. I will always prefer a button to it, but that's just me. The other interesting thing is it introduced the concept of juggling, which is when you knock an opponent in the air and you can continue to hit them. Between that, the blocking, and the fact that some of the characters in this game, their special moves are strictly done by using directional inputs. That was really a first, because every other one would be something like down forward B or down forward A. I really enjoyed it, and I got used to it. I will say there is a little bit of a lag, and it's probably due to the digitized sprites. However, I got used to it. I was fine with it. Jim, on the other hand, he was a little more harsh on this game. I gave the Super NES a 7. Jim gave it a 5. Surprise, surprise. And I gave the Genesis a 6. Jim gave it a 6 as well. The only reason I gave the Genesis a 6 is that goddamn 3-button control was annoying with this game. As far as the beer requirement is concerned, I'm only going to add 2 once again. Yes, it's not the smoothest control in the world, but I appreciate that they tried something new.
Alright, the gameplay. Really, it's basically the same on both versions. Obvious caveat here is that the Super NES toned down the violence. They changed the fatalities, they got rid of the blood, yada 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 yada, stuff we already know.
Pussies!
Can't argue there. All the blood and the extra violence is available on the Genesis, but on this port you need a code to put it in to unlock it all. At least it's there. Each version has the same structure. You have single matches, endurance rounds, test your strength mini-games, and then you fight Goro and Shang Tsung. There's also multiplayer modes in each. And, as Bryce said, the block button. I hate the block button, but that's just me. But outside of all that, it's a simple fighting game. There really isn't a combo system in the game, but you can just mash the punch button and hit them with another special attack after, so you can quasi-do combos. And like Bryce said, you can at least do the juggling. The movesets are really basic, and every character basically plays the same outside of a small handful of their special moves. And of course, in this early game, each character only had 1 fatality, which is a little bit of a bummer, but still, fatalities were so new at the time, you took what you could get. Both ports are a little rough around the edges, but at the end of the day, they're still fun games, even 20 years later. In the end, we both gave the Super NES a 6, and we both gave the Genesis a 7. And yes, the reason for the point difference is because of the violence and the fatalities being changed.
Because Nintendo was being a pussy!
Damn right. This might be a little different for me, but I still have a blast with this game, so I'm only going to add 1 beer. You don't need a lot to have fun with it.
For a game that came out in 1992, you might be thinking, how much originality could there be? I'd like to compare this to the Star Wars films. Star Wars took a lot of ideas from other movies, books, and genres, combined them all in a way that we hadn't seen before. That's exactly how I feel about Mortal Kombat. Yes, you have a high punch and a low punch, just like every other fighting game. You have uppercuts, you have special moves, but where it really sticks out is the fatalities. Some people feel that fatalities are cheap and just gimmicky, but guess what? Every friggin' kid who played this game couldn't wait to try it. And yeah, 90% of the time people couldn't pull it off, but if you did, that was so badass, and it just looks awesome. I love the fatalities. As Jim mentioned, we still love the shit out of this game. And the other thing I really found interesting is the inclusion of Reptile. Now, he's hidden, and it's hard as shit to get to him. You have to be fighting on the pit, and you have to see something go across the moon, and actually I think it's Santa's sleigh or something. There's all these other rules. Bottom line is, I tried it recently, and I still couldn't get to him, but I remember as a kid getting to him once in a while. I don't know if I've ever beaten him, but having an Easter egg or a secret like that was really unknown in fighting games at that time. Go ahead, just try and think of a fighting game at the time that had that kind of secret in it. And this is a trend that would continue on and on throughout the rest of Mortal Kombat. So This game really threw a lot of originality at you. I gave the originality a 10, Jim gave it a 9, and it was the same for both systems. There's not much more to say. I'm not even going to add a beer. This game was original as shit, and I was so happy when it came along and brought some real violence to fighting games.
Well, this will be short. You have 7 different characters, they all have different endings. So, that's a reason to at least play through the single player mode 7 times. You have multiplayer. Playing against buddies is fun. As long as you like the game, you'll keep going back to it. And as Brian mentioned, Reptile. He is a bitch to get, and he only happens on randomly triggered events. So, good luck, you're gonna have to try a lot to get him. Overall, we gave it 7s across the board, and as far as beers go, what the hell, 1 more. Some more characters would have been nice.
So overall, me and Jim, I think, are being really fair about how we're rating this game, and it was revolutionary, but as it holds up today, me and him still have plenty of fun with it, but it's by no means perfect. There's a lot of improvements that would come later in the series, but still, as the first of any game, it was awesome. As you see, I gave it a 7 for both systems, Jim gave it a 6. I liked it just a little more, probably because of the block button and things of that nature.
Exactly because of the block button!
Jim's just mad because he sucks using a block button. But anyway, oddly enough, even with all the score differentials, both of them round out to a 6.9, which is fair because, let's face it, we've played every single fighting game on the Super NES and on the Genesis, and by no means is this a 8, 9, or even 10 worthy game. For historical significance, yeah, maybe. But as far as our scores go, 6.9, that sounds about right to me and Jim. As far as the beer pairing is concerned, we're going to be going with Dragon's Milk from the New Holland Brewing Company. This is one of our personal favorites, and the obvious caveat, it has a dragon on it, as it is strong enough to let you forgive all those imperfections with the graphics and sound. As always, guys, make sure you drink your beers and play your games responsibly. And thanks for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you click subscribe, give us a like, or tell your friends about us. Tune in. Make sure you keep checking in every day this week as we have brand new Mortal Kombat content all month long. Cheers.